Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be talking about writing fractions as decimals. This means that we are going to be able to take fractions and rewrite them in decimal form. And we're also going to practice putting those numbers onto a number line. Now, the first thing we need to talk about when we talk about decimals is place value. And I know you remember it from the beginning of the year, but we always start off with our units. And after our units, we have tens. Tens are how many times bigger than our units? Well, it's 10 times bigger. 2 times 10 is 20. 20 times 10 would be 200. Hundreds are our next one. We then go to thousands, which are 10 times bigger than hundreds. Alright, and every time we move up one place value, the value of that column or that place value goes up 10 times. Alright, and think about that. A 2 in our units column is only worth 2 units. If I move this 2 to our tens and I had 0 units, I would now have 20. If I moved this 2 to our hundreds and had 0 tens, I would now have 200. 200 is 10 times 20. 20 is 10 times 1. And every time we move a place further to the left, the value goes up 10 times. But today what I want to know is, what do you think would happen if I moved to the right after my units or ones place? Well, if going to the left means that the numbers are getting 10 times bigger, then moving to the right would mean that my numbers are getting 10 times smaller. So after my units, I always put a decimal. And that decimal point shows us at what point our numbers become smaller than wholes. Alright? And you can have any number, 3, 2, 1. If I put the decimal over here, it would mean that this becomes my units. If I change this and I put the decimal point over here, this would be units and this would be tens. Alright, so this decimal point tells us a lot about the number that we're working with, and it's important that we start putting that into our work now. So what I'm wondering is, if I move to the right and things get 10 times smaller, or when I move to the left, units times 10 units gave me tens. If they get 10 times smaller, I'm actually dividing something into 10 pieces. Can you divide a unit into 10 pieces? Well, I think you can. If we have one whole unit here and we divide it up into 10 equally sized pieces, what do we call each of these pieces? 1 divided into 10 equally sized pieces would give us 1/10. Okay, if I had 3 of those, that would be 3 tenths. Makes sense? Wonderful. But we already know how to deal with 3 tenths as a fraction. What do you think I would put here as a decimal? Well, this first column here is going to be our column for tens, because it's 1/10 the size of our units. So if this is tenths with a very baby t, I will have to put it over here. How many tenths have I got over here? 3 tenths. I would have a 3 in my tenths column. How many units have I got? Well, I've got no wholes, so I have to put a 0 here. Have I got anything smaller? Well, no, so I could put zeros here. But what I'm wondering is, do I really need to put zeros in all of these place values? Well, I'll have you know that these place values continue infinitely. And if we were to try and put zeros in for all of those values, we would be here for the rest of our lives every time we tried to write a number. So if you're dealing with only one decimal, you don't have to worry about all of the extra zeros. They actually mean nothing unless there's something to fill them. So if I wanted to show 3/10 as a decimal, I would usually just put a 0 in my ones place. I'd show my decimal point and I would put the amount of tenths that I had down. If I wanted to show 5/10, for example, I have 5 in my tenths column. So 5/10 would be equal to 0 ones and 5/10, 0.5. Okay, but what I'm wondering now is what is going to be smaller than tenths? If I went 10 times bigger every time I moved to the left-hand side, surely I must get 10 times smaller every time I move further to the right-hand side. What is 10 times smaller than 1/10? 1/10 divided into, if this whole thing here is 1/10, divided into 10 equally sized pieces is going to be equal to, each of these pieces will be 1/100th. Okay? So this column over here is going to be our hundredths column. These are a little bit smaller here. Okay? The reason for that is 10 hundredths makes 1/10. Alright, 1/10 split into 10 equally sized pieces is going to give you 10 hundredths. So we practiced a little bit with that yesterday. But if I had this fraction over here, let's say 6 hundredths, I would have to write it as 0 ones. Don't forget your decimal point. I don't have any tenths, and I have 6 hundredths. All right. If I had 9 hundredths, I would write that as a decimal as 0.09, or we should actually probably write that underneath. 0.09. I have 0 ones, I have 0 tenths, and I have 9 hundredths. We need to put these zeros in here because they give us information about the place. All right? Anything after, we do not need to put. Okay? All of these ones, unless there are values in those places, we do not need to include. All right. But this is just the introduction. Yesterday, or in our last lesson, we added tenths and hundredths. And we found that if I added 5 tenths and 6 hundredths, I would get a fraction that looked like this. 56 hundredths, because 5 tenths is equal to 50 hundredths. 50 plus 6 is 56. So if I wanted to write this as a decimal, what do you think I would need to do? Well, if I was given just this, it might be a little bit difficult, because if I have 0 ones, 0 tenths, how can I put 56 in this column here? You can't, can you? All right? But the trick is to know that this answer over here could be taken back into this form. If I have 5 tenths and 6 hundredths, I know exactly what needs to go into each column. So 5 tenths means I get a 5 in my tenths column and a 6 in my hundredths column. 56 over 100 is equal to 0.56 in decimal form. Alright? So if we get any question where we have a fraction over 100, let's look at 67 hundredths. If I had this, I would say to myself, well, I've got 7 hundredths, and this 60 hundredths is the same as 6 tenths. And now that it's in this form, I can quite easily say, hey, well, in decimal form, I would have 0 units, I would have 6 tenths, and 7 hundredths. Okay? Whenever we have tens in our fraction over 100, we can put those in the tens column, and the units will go into the hundredths column. Now imagine this, we have 67 hundredths. If I added 4 hundredths to this number, how would I do that? Well, I'd look at my hundredths column and I'd have 7 hundredths, 8 hundredths, 9 hundredths, 10 hundredths. Well, 10 hundredths would mean that I need to put 1 over into this column. So it works exactly the same as our addition did in the past. If I add 0.04 4 hundredths, 7 plus 4 is 11, and I would carry this extra. From here I have 10 hundredths, which gives me 1/10. Okay, and I end up with this as my final answer. Now, this isn't super important for at the moment. We just need to know how to get from this to our decimal form. But I thought you'd find it interesting to see the relationship between our hundredths and our tenths, and that it works the same as our ones and our tens, or our tens and our hundreds. All right? Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about is how to show numbers like this on a number line. Well, in our previous number lines, we probably would have started at 0 and we would have worked our way up to 10, for example. And each of these would be a point, and that would be 1 hole, 2 holes, 3 holes, 4 holes, and if we got to this point, we would have 4. But in this new example, we're dealing with numbers that are smaller than 1. So if I start at 0 and I have my number line going to 1, that means that I would split this number line up into 10 equally sized pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each of these represents 1/10. 1 over 10. But we also know now that 1/10 can be written in decimal form as 0.1. So as I move up this number line, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. I get 0.4 over here, and my fraction would be 1, 2, 3, 4 tenths. 4 tenths is 0.4. I've got 4 in my tenths column. But what if I had an example like 0.5 4, 5. Well, we know that this is hundreds, and I don't really want to be splitting this up into 100 pieces just yet. So if we had our number line again, starting at 0, ending at 1, and we split this up into 10 equally sized pieces, where do you think 0.45 would be? Well, if I start at 0 and I go up by tenths, I go 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, but I still have to go up 500ths. Now 500ths is, each of these would be split into 10 equally sized pieces. 500ths is exactly halfway between 4/10 and 5/10. So if I have 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and 0.5 over here, 0.45 would be halfway between 0.4 and 0.5. I can mark that off just over there. Mark it off in red. Now, 0.45 is smaller than 0.5. Okay? We have not yet got to 0.5. Okay? If this example was let's come up with a new one, 0.37, I could start off at 0 and I'd go 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and then this tenth over here would be split up into 10 equally sized pieces. Now, 7/100ths is going to be closer to 4/10 than it is to 3/10. So I'd say that my line would be just over there. Okay? I hope that you guys have understood what I've tried to explain here. I know it might be a little bit difficult in order to try and think about whole numbers split into 10 equally sized pieces, and each of those 10 equally sized pieces being split into another 10 equally sized pieces to give you hundreds. But if you can figure that out, then this should be quite a manageable concept for you. Now, the important things to take away is if we want to write fractions as decimals, all right, and it's easier when we've got just hundreds or just tenths, but if we've got 37/100ths, it's important that when we look at this, we can say, well, that is the same as 3/10 plus 7/100. All right, and that will very easily allow us to write it in our decimal form. And this is almost the reverse of what we did in our last lesson. We were saying 3/10 plus 7/100 is 37/10. I want you now, if you need to write fractions as decimals, to think, well, I've got 37/100, which is 3/10 plus 7/100, and kind of go in reverse to what you were doing before. I hope you guys found this understandable and enjoyable, and I wish you the best of luck for answering the questions in this. Thank you so much, and have a nice day. Bye.